What a week. Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
It's, by the way, I'm hearing more and more reports that the man who's been really pushing this idea of let's patch up things with Russia so that we can turn them against
Mhm.
China is apparently Elbridge Colby, and he's
Uh,
apparently exercising a huge amount of influence. And
mhm,
there's a very sinister figure who writes really very, very strange articles, rather scary articles for the
mhm,
national interest, called Aaron West Mitchell, who back in 2021 was advocating a war in Ukraine to defeat Russia and
mhm.
thereby replace the current Russian government with a pro-Western one,
Uh,
which would then turn against
okay.
China.
Okay.
Turns out he's a close friend of Elbridge Colby. So there we go. So I mean, it all comes back, as I always say, in the end, it's always about
Mhm.
China.
Yeah. And also always about these deep state people, right? Like Victoria
Absolutely. Yeah,
Nuland, they just, for
absolutely.
some reason, always have a lot of influence, whoever is
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
president, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Whatever happens, they're always there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and very influential. They somehow can convince, can get their way.
Absolutely.
It's just so
Absolutely.
incredible. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Of course, the big topic is about all these things going on with the peace deal, if there is one. Okay.
Mm.
The the latest one I just saw like 30 minutes ago, Sergei Lavrov had an interview with the NBC, and he basically said there is no one-on-one meeting between Zelensky and Putin planned. He
No.
said that President Putin is always ready to, negotiate and
Yeah.
talk, but there has to be a real agenda, which apparently there isn't one. So,
Yes.
so there is nothing. Okay, we can talk about that later, but I want
Yes.
to
Absolutely.
go back to step by step because it's so confusing. So
Yes.
how do we get here? All right.
Yes.
So exactly what did Trump and Putin agreed on during their meeting? Let's start with there.
They agreed on one thing and one thing only. Everything else is confusion and noise. They agreed that there should not be a ceasefire in
Okay.
Ukraine,
Okay.
that there should be that the war itself will continue until there is a comprehensive settlement, so that there will be negotiations taking place even as the fighting itself continues. That is the Russian position. The Americans, of course, have resisted it. The Americans, since the start of Trump's presidency, have been trying to get a ceasefire. The Ukrainians and the Europeans have been trying to get a ceasefire because they want a ceasefire because they know that Ukraine is losing the war. So they want a ceasefire to stop the war.
Yeah. Mhm.
And the Russians worry that if that happened, it would be Minsk all over again. They would spin up the negotiations indefinitely. That would give time for Ukraine to rest and rearm, and the war would start basically from the beginning all over again. So the Russians have said no, no ceasefire, and Trump agreed with them at the meeting on Friday. Nothing else has been agreed at all. Nothing, and I think that's a very important and clear point to understand.
Yeah, that's where the confusion is because
Yes,
the big thing is the security guarantee, right?
yes,
That's where it's so confusing because on Monday, Zelensky and the Chinese media calls them the seven dwarfs.
yeah,
They had a meeting in the White House. It's a
yeah,
remarkable to watch. But anyway, so the one thing that's striking to me when Zelensky was asked about, the meeting to give a speech, the very first thing he said was he's very happy to hear about the security guarantees from the United States. And
yes,
that seems like what Trump told him. And so
yes,
my interpretation at the time is that Putin somehow agreed to not a NATO membership, but NATO-like guarantee, security guarantee, which I
yes,
find is hard to believe, but I thought that's probably what Putin agreed to, because that's the
yes,
impression I got. But
yes,
then later, Trump was asked about it. He didn't rule out the US ground troop. He didn't rule out. But then, of course, Russian came back, said, no, no, we never agreed to
yes,
something like that. And then Trump said, no US troop on the ground.
yes.
So what exactly is this security guarantee is about?
Yes, I'm going to just anticipate by saying that the reason for all of this confusion is because this meeting between Trump and Putin was arranged in extraordinary haste. Trump wanted this meeting very fast and very early because he didn't want to impose sanctions. Or I will correct that, I will take that back. He didn't want to impose 100% tariffs on China. That's really what he didn't want to do. You see, he threatened that he would impose these massive tariffs on anybody who was buying Russian oil. China buys lots of oil. He knows that if he does that, if he goes and imposes 100% tariffs on China, um, that's going to propel him back into the economic war he found himself in the spring. We know very well that that didn't turn out at all well. So he didn't want to do that. So he contacted Putin. He sent Witkoff to Moscow. He said to Witkoff, "You've got to get this meeting with Putin organized as quickly as possible because I need to have some reason not to impose these sanctions and these tariffs that I was talking about." So Putin, who was not keen on the meeting, by the way, I mean, it took him 3 hours, took Witkoff 3 hours to persuade him. Anyway, Putin eventually said yes. They met in Anchorage. They agreed on this one thing. The Russians, I think, got that agreed by the Americans before the meeting took place. This is the so-called acceptable offer that the Americans made, which led Putin to agree to the meeting, that there would not be a ceasefire. And they had the meeting. The Russians set out their position. The Americans set out their position. The Russians the Americans said, we're going to have a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement one day. We got to think about Ukraine's security. Putin, as he said in the press conference, says, look, we're not against providing Ukraine with security guarantees. That's what we did in the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022. Trump, of course, doesn't know anything about the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022. He doesn't have that kind of depth of understanding of this problem. He didn't research it or investigate it because the Americans never do anymore. There was no pre-meetings between officials, such as one would expect, where all of this could have been cleared up and sorted out in advance. So Trump came away from the meeting telling everybody the Russians have agreed to security guarantees, which is what I previously, when I was trying to explain to the Europeans, when I spoke to them 2 days before the meeting, I told them that, I wasn't against giving Ukraine security guarantees. So he comes away telling everybody the Russians have agreed. And of course, the Russians have not agreed to the security guarantees he thinks they have. They are simply referring back to what they agreed with the Ukrainians back in April 2022, which is something completely different. And we will come to what that was shortly. It's entirely a product of the chaotic, disorganized way in which Donald Trump and the American administration conducts diplomacy.
So what exactly is the security guarantee that the Russians referring to? They wanted some kind of UN security?
Yes, yes. What they said was that this is in April 2022, and it was agreed to by the Ukrainians, by the way, and initialed by the Ukrainians. The entire Istanbul Agreement, the original April 2022 Istanbul Agreement, was agreed by the Ukrainians. So in return for various concessions by Ukraine, of which the most important was that it would stay outside NATO, and that it would reduce the size of its armed forces. The Russians said that Ukraine would receive guarantees for its security from the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain. And any other country such as Turkey or Israel or whichever, which wanted to give security guarantees to Ukraine itself. These security guarantees would be that after the agreement, what was left of Ukrainian territory would receive an explicit guarantee that there would be no attacks on it. Remember, Russia would be one of the guarantees.
Yeah.
And in order to prevent any threat to any country, and of course this means Russia, from Ukrainian territory, each guarantor country would be able to veto deployment of troops on Ukrainian territory, even for brief temporary periods, by any other country. So there would be no Russian troops in Ukraine because the Western powers would have a right of veto of that. And there would be no Western troops in Ukraine because the Russians would have a veto power over that too.
Okay.
And that was the security guarantees that the Russians were talking about and which the Ukrainians agreed to in March, April 2022. Now, just to anticipate, the main reason why that agreement, which was negotiated and reached between the Americans, between the Russians and the Ukrainians in April 2022, was never put into effect, is because Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, speaking on behalf of Britain and the United States, told the Ukrainians, if you go ahead with this agreement, Britain and the United States will not agree to give these security guarantees. So that takes us whole circle round, and it explains the whole situation. So there we are.
Well, Victoria Nuland actually explained this in one of her interviews. Yeah. She actually said that the reason that they torpedoed it because he said that you have the Russians to guarantee the Ukrainians. How can you trust that? How can you trust the Russians? Yes. So that's their reason, I guess. Yeah.
Yes.
Even though that looks much more appealing today than it was, than now. Okay.
Yes.
And in light of that, Bill Clinton actually recently said something which always I think is need to be clarified. He said that when one of the reasons he thinks is strongly to continue to support Ukraine is because he said when he was a president, he's the one who convinced the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear weapons. So he's talking about the Budapest memorandum again, right?
Yes.
So I think there's still a lot of confusions, people misunderstanding about it. Can you explain exactly what?
No, I mean
what's the promise there?
There isn't just confusion. This is outright lying. Ukraine never had any nuclear weapons. I mean, this is the key thing to understand. The nuclear weapons that we're talking about were those of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, of course, was part of the Soviet Union. Some Soviet nuclear weapons, bombers, their bombs, some missiles, long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, were located on Ukrainian territory. When the Soviet Union broke up, the military command and the military command soldiers who were in charge of these nuclear weapons continued to take their instructions from the military command in Moscow. The Russians, in other words, controlled these nuclear weapons, which were located on Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainians never had control of these nuclear weapons, and they were never their nuclear weapons. The Ukrainians would not have been able to take control of these nuclear weapons if they had captured, if they just marched in and taken physical possession of them. There are all sorts of fail-safes and controls for nuclear weapons, the special codes and things of that kind, which you would need to have. The Ukrainians didn't have them and weren't given them and would never have been able to have them. And of course, the other thing which people consistently overlook is that when Ukraine became independent, as a condition of it becoming independent and enshrined in its constitution at the time of its independence, there was a provision that it would be nuclear free. So this is the reality of it. Now, the Russians were very worried about the fact that those nuclear weapons were in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
The Americans were very worried about the fact that those nuclear weapons were in Ukraine, because, of course, those nuclear weapons were not secure. A terrorist group might be able to get control of them and might be able to use the sword coverage or whatever, but they could dismantle them. They could do all kinds of things with them. It was very, very bad. So they needed to persuade the Ukrainians to agree to hand them back to the Russians, to give them back to Russian control. So there was a long, detailed negotiation. The Americans were pushing to get the Ukrainians to return their nuclear weapons. And at the end of that process, the Ukrainians agreed they had no choice, because they needed economic assistance at that time, both from the Americans and, by the way, the Russians, because this was a period of immense economic crisis caused by the Soviet Union's collapse. So they handed over these nuclear weapons, or at least they allowed the Russians to go into Ukraine and to retrieve these nuclear weapons. And in return, there was this Budapest memorandum. Now, this memorandum did not give any guarantees to Ukraine. I mean, this is the other thing that is a misconception. This was never an agreement to give Ukraine security guarantees. What it basically said was that all of these countries, on the basis that Ukraine has handed over its nuclear, all those nuclear, doesn't say Ukraine, never says that they're Ukrainian nuclear weapons, that Ukraine is now going to be a nuclear-free state, that all of the surrounding countries recognize Ukraine on the basis of its then existing borders. But of course, this is all based, again, predicated on Ukraine being also a neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free country, as its constitution at that time said. So it was part of a package of agreements that were reached at the end of the Cold War. And what people do today is that they ignore the rest of the package. There were lots of other agreements reached at that time, including agreements that NATO would not be expanded eastwards. And also, Ukraine would be neutral and non-aligned. And all of these agreements, basically were woven together in a single package. What people do is they take the Budapest memorandum, look at it separately from all of the others, and then misrepresent its terms. It's a very complicated thing to discuss. But, and of course, complexity, when you discuss it, always, people roll up their eyes and they don't listen. The Western narrative sounds easy. But if you read the Budapest memorandum itself, which I've done many times, by the way, I mean, all of this becomes immediately clear. It did not guarantee Ukraine. It was not a security guarantees for Ukraine. And Ukraine did not agree to give up nuclear weapons because it never had any.
So at the maximum, you can say that at the time, Ukraine had the opportunity to hold on to something that they cannot really use, but will vary both Soviet and the US. At the maximum, that's what they could do at the time.
That's exactly right. I mean, if Ukraine had gone in and seized those nuclear weapons, there would have been a massive crisis in Europe. The Americans would have been absolutely beside themselves with anger and worry about it, because, of course, they would have been very worried about what would happen to those nuclear weapons then, especially given the fact that Ukraine itself couldn't use them.
And it also covers Belarus, right? And one more country, I think. So they're not just Ukraine. Okay.
It does, and it has another provision. Another provision of the Budapest memorandum is that the signatory countries, which of course included the United States, would not interfere in the internal affairs of the countries involved, Belarus and Ukraine. Well, of course, as we know, the United States has massively interfered in the internal affairs of both of those countries. And during the protests that took place in Belarus in 2020, a number of people at that time pointed out, this is in 2020, remember, before the start of the special military operation and the war in Ukraine, they pointed out to the United States that it was interfering in the internal affairs of Belarus, and this was contrary to the provisions of the Budapest memorandum. And the American embassy in Minsk published a statement that this really didn't matter because the Budapest memorandum did not have any force in international law. They actually said that.
Okay. So Bill Clinton forgets all that. All right.
Yes, I know.
Okay. Very typical Americans, I think. Now, in the midst of all this, one more thing that doesn't got a lot of attention is Ukraine actually cut out the oil supply to the Druzhba pipeline, which are the oil supply to Hungary and Slovakia.
Yeah.
I was trying to pinpoint the exact time, but it's hard to the exact time, but it's around the Monday, the 18th. That's all these things happen when there's a meeting going on in Washington. Around that time, there is also that is happening. And then also Trump was calling Orban immediately after the meeting with the Alaska meeting with Putin, basically trying to convince Orban to allow Ukraine to join EU. My understanding, that's the phone call.
Yeah.
Why does Ukraine do something like that in such a crucial time?
Well, that's an excellent question. And of course, it's very difficult to give a simple and coherent answer because, I mean, it seems completely illogical. Now, I'm going to make a guess here. I think the Ukrainians and the Europeans have been talking about this together for a long, long time. The Europeans don't want to stop imports of oil and gas from Russia into Europe. And they really don't like Orban, and they really don't like Fico. And I think they're making a major effort at the moment to try to destabilize these governments. And there is an ongoing color revolution attempt taking place in Serbia, as we're talking about. So all of this, because all of these three countries are working together. So this is all part of that process. And I have to say, I mean, this sounds a bit conspiracist, but with people like this, I mean, you can't disregard this. I think this is all part of an attempt to try to put pressure on Orban and ultimately on Fico. The Europeans hate Orban. They don't like the fact that he has this influence that he does have over Trump, and they wanted to find some means to undermine him. And they want to do that by interfering with the supplies of oil and gas. And the Ukrainians want to do that too.
They must understand that Trump shouldn't like this because Trump is trying to convince Orban to help Ukraine in some way to join the EU. And then something like this happens. I mean, how can Trump be happy about this?
You would have thought that he would not be happy about this, and you would expect that Orban would complain about this to Trump. But Trump comes across to me as a deeply, deeply confused man. I don't think he has ever really got on top of this problem. And I don't think he really understands how all of the various different pieces move. So at the moment, at that meeting on Monday, he wanted to basically calm the Europeans down. He just had this meeting with Putin, and the Europeans were very upset and angry about it. So his purpose of that meeting, very unwisely, was to lead the Europeans to think that actually, really, I'm on your side. We're going to talk about security guarantees for Ukraine. We're going to talk about a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and I will be there too. And so he didn't want to be hard on them because he wanted to win them over. And so he just looks the other way as his friends, Orban's pipeline is destroyed. A strong leader conducting a clear policy on behalf of the United States would not behave like that. He would have simply said to the Europeans, look, I've just heard that Ukraine has just attacked this pipeline. That is completely unacceptable unless I have a promise from you now that stops all further intelligence assistance to Ukraine ends. And I want to have that commitment from you now. That's what a strong leader does. That's what you'd expect the president of the United States to do. But Trump never does this. He always tries to split the difference and creates massive confusion and muddle in the process.
Well, one thing that I find very confusing for his behavior is this letter from Melania Trump to Putin. I never quite understand the purpose of that because if you read the letter, what it says that she said that Mr. Putin, you can single-handedly restore children's melodic laughter in protecting the innocence of these children. So she basically, to me, the letter is about children that somehow Putin can single-handedly, help them, which sounds to me like she's blaming Putin for not helping them. Yeah. Since it's such an easy thing for you. I think when Putin read a letter like that, Putin cannot be particularly happy about this. So what's the purpose of a letter like that?
Well, I mean, I think it was frankly not just a bad letter, but even a sinister letter. One gets the sense that Melania is very much on the side of the Europeans and all of these people, and that doesn't really agree with Trump's attempts to try to make up with the Russians in some way, and that she's been a consistent. She's constantly pushing against this. I mean, supposedly. Trump himself said that he has these good calls with Putin, and then he goes and he meets Melania, and she's complaining to him about the fact that the Russians are attacking Kiev again, and it seems that she has that kind of influence. So clearly, yes, it was an attempt to blame Putin for the plight of children. It's, I think, fairly obvious what this refers to. Yeah. Which is this narrative, it's only a narrative. I mean, I can tell you as a lawyer who used to do this kind of work about child abduction cases, that the Russians have abducted 20,000 children from Ukraine. Melania clearly believes this story, which is a complete fantasy. I mean, it's not complete facts, it's a complete fiction, but she clearly believes this story or pretends that she does. So she gave Trump this letter. She's probably very angry that Trump was meeting this evil man. Trump weakly passes it on. And apparently there's been some pushback, so the letter isn't quite explicit. But I, as you correctly said, I don't think Putin was impressed or would have taken it very well, frankly. I don't think Putin would have been happy about the fact that Trump called him, even at the same time as Zelensky and all of those European officials were in the White House, actually. I think that Putin almost certainly would have seen that as an attempt to put pressure on him.
Well, I did a program about the Melania Trump's letter. I just wanted my viewers to, my Chinese viewers to know what is going on there. Lots of people commented saying, well, how about the children in Gaza? Does Melania Trump care about that? I think that's a good point.
Well, it's an excellent point. In fact, I mean, if anybody can bring melodious laughter back to children, it's not Putin, it's Trump. He can tell Netanyahu, you stop tomorrow. If you don't stop, no more economic or military aid from the United States.
In the meantime, right now, just happening when they were negotiating in Alaska, there's another thing. The State Department just stopped issuing visa for Gaza children. That's exactly what they did.
I know. Yeah.
So why didn't Melania Trump to put pressure on Trump for that?
Well, exactly. Yeah. Well, exactly. Oh, she doesn't like. I get the sense she doesn't like Russia. I mean, she's internalized the usual assumptions about Russia that many people have. I suspect there's lots of arguments between the two of them. Anyway, that's my guess.
You see, that's the difference between the Chinese and probably even the East view about the First Lady. That in China, it's deeply resentment, against if any women, the wives involved in the husband's affair. That's deeply resented, Whereas in the West, that seems like a good thing. That seems like almost encouraged to do so.
Yes, I know. Absolutely. It's the same in Russia, by the way. The Russians are the same as the Chinese. I don't know whether you remember, but Gorbachev, his wife, Raisa, played a very big role in his policies. And of course, she was very, very much somebody who wanted rapprochement with the West. She took
Uh-huh.
very strongly liberal views. Um, the Russian people didn't like it at all. It was very, very widely resented there. I mean, it was seen as another example of the extent to which Gorbachev had become westernized.
Mhm.
Mhm.
To be honest, I actually think as a couple, regardless of what you do, I really think that the couple should do their own respective things,
Yeah.
not too much interfere with each other. I just never think that's a good idea, you know?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, can I just say, I mean, Catherine and I, my wife, are
Mhm.
Westerners, but
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
exactly the stance that we take. I
Mhm.
mean, we each are aware of what the other does. She's an
Yeah.
academic. I do
Mhm.
all the things that I do, but I mean, we don't have to. We don't give each other scorecards every day and ask the other advice. I mean, that's absurd.
Exactly. I mean, the same thing with
Or rather, give unsolicited advice to.
well, the same thing with my husband. I think I
Yeah,
enjoy the fact that I can do whatever I want.
exactly.
I'm sure lots of things he might not agree with me. We even
Yes.
sometimes voted for different people, when
Well, there you
elections
go.
comes. But I never try to change him, and nor
Yes.
does he trying to change
Yes.
me
Yes.
on these kind of things. I
Yes.
think that's best way, just give each other room, right? So,
Well, absolutely. Well, I mean, the Americans have invented this concept of the first lady, which, of
yeah.
course, is no, or the first spouse, I suppose, when we get the next, when we eventually do get a woman president, which,
Mhm.
of course, has no existence in the U.S. Constitution or U.S. law. But I mean, this is something that has happened, and you're absolutely correct. It's absurd. It's wrong, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so moving forward, if it's now questionable whether there's going to be a one-on-one meeting between Zelensky and Putin, if there is a meeting where there seems the location is a problem, because
Oh
Putin talked about the Moscow, and I don't think Zelensky wants to go to Moscow.
no,
And it's questionable if Trump is going to join them. But so if not Moscow, there's a few other places. One is Geneva, but I don't think Putin wants to go to Geneva. Geneva is
no,
supposed to be a neutral place, but they changed that themselves, right?
yeah,
And the other is Belarus Minsk. But my question with Minsk is that there has been two Minsk agreement already.
yeah.
So a third one, I don't know how good that can be. And of course, somebody proposed Turkey and also Beijing. Now, what do you think? Where could be the best location?
Well, I think the most likely location is Istanbul,
Okay.
and it's a fact that Putin had a telephone call.
Uh,
I think the day before yesterday with Erdogan, and if you look at what the Russians have been saying, they've been very, very clear that the negotiation process is the one that is ongoing
mhm,
between Russian and Ukrainian negotiating teams, which has been meeting in Istanbul. They've now had 3 meetings with each other. The Russians have said this format needs to be strengthened and expanded. They've talked about setting up 3 working parties. They've said that the delegation heads could be upgraded.
mhm,
They've left it open that once these groups meet and if progress towards a settlement is made, then Putin and Zelensky could meet. But if that's correct, then the logical venue would be Istanbul.
okay.
And I think that's most likely where it will be. I don't imagine that Zelensky will want to go to Moscow.
Mhm,
Putin will not want to go to Geneva. As you
mhm,
absolutely rightly say, the Russians don't consider Switzerland to be a neutral
mhm,
country
mhm,
anymore. In fact, they
mhm,
consider it to be an unfriendly country. Budapest has also been proposed, but that's also in the European Union. I don't think the Russians would want to go there.
mhm.
Beijing, I mean, they'd be very happy to go there, but I don't think Zelensky would want to
Well,
go there.
uh-huh,
So
uh-huh.
I think Istanbul is by far the most likely place.
If it happens, because like I
If it
said,
happens.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I watched you and John Mearsheimer and
Yeah.
Glenn Deason, right? That conversation. It was very good. It's explained a lot of
Yeah.
things for me because
Yeah.
it's so confused,
Yes. Yes.
so confusing the whole thing.
Yes.
And then we will see whether it happens. But one thing is the Europeans, right? I think in your show you explained very, very well about the Europeans why they see this whole thing as such a
Yeah.
catastrophe for them. if they have a peace agreement or something. Can you explain that to my audience? So
Yes, from their point of view, from the point of view of the European powers,
mhm,
they're weak, they're disorganized, and they have a very, very long history of rivalry with each other.
yeah,
They have, over the last 80 years, because of the United States, avoided wars with each other. But that doesn't mean that all the tensions that exist in Europe have gone away. And they've also embarked on this very ambitious and complicated process of European construction, which has led to the European Union, which also is having deeply unhappy and difficult outcomes. If the United States leaves Europe, if the United States leaves Ukraine, then a number of things start to happen. The European Union itself starts to become unsustainable because it needs the United States to be there to keep it together. The Europeans themselves, with their very, very fragmented and broken economies, then risk increasing rivalries with each other. And of course, they also have the great nightmare of being left with the Russians by themselves. And the Russians they've managed to make the Russians very, very angry with them. And
mhm,
as we can all see, Russia is not just a much bigger country than any other European country, it is also orders of magnitude more powerful.
mhm,
So the Europeans, for all of these various reasons, are desperate to keep the Americans in Europe. And in order to keep the Americans in Europe, they need to keep the Americans in Ukraine. If the Americans pull out of Ukraine,
mhm,
then they might start to have second doubts about whether they should stay in Europe. So this is what European policy ultimately is all about. If it means prolonging the war in Ukraine, if it means destroying Ukraine, if it means creating a situation where there is an outright Russian victory, all of that is better than seeing the Americans go. it's, I have to say, it's a strategy appalls me. I am ashamed of it,
mhm,
given the history of all of these countries.
mhm,
But it explains for your viewers, your Chinese viewers,
mhm,
why you saw all of those pictures of those European leaders
yeah,
going to Washington,
mhm,
carrying before Trump. These are the countries that 100 years ago were mighty powers.
yeah,
Britain and its empire,
mhm,
France and its
uh-huh.
empire, Germany, all of these countries, they're now there,
Leaders.
begging the Americans to stay because they've become, in effect, marginal players. And the only way in which they can retain influence, preserve a kind of unstable stability in Europe itself, and keep the Russians,
Mhm,
away from their door, is by keeping the Americans in. There is a very, very famous quip that was made by the first NATO Secretary General back in the 1940s, and his name is Lord Ismay. He was British, and he said the entire purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in,
mhm,
the Russians out,
mhm,
and the Germans down.
mhm,
Nobody cares about the Germans anymore. Nobody really
mhm,
believes they're a
mhm,
threat. But it's
yeah,
basically about keeping the Europeans
mhm.
at peace with each other, keeping the Russians out. And for that, you need to keep the Americans in.
Well, well, then my question is this whole EU project.
Mm,
Because the idea is to you put all these smaller countries, right, relative speak to Russia and to
mm,
US, you put them all together so you become more powerful,
yeah,
right? You're all together, you're economically have more opportunities, and everybody should grow together. And supposedly, my understanding is that you can because you're bigger now, so you can, if needed militarily, you have the NATO, to protect you. So the
yeah.
whole idea of the European Union is that you can stand alone as a powerful unit.
You
That
know,
doesn't
this is
work.
No, you know something, Sophia. This is my great mistake in life, because for most of my life I was an absolute strong supporter, first of the European Economic Community, and then it became the European
Mhm.
Community.
Yeah,
And when the European Union was first launched in the 1990s, I still thought this was a good thing.
yeah,
The idea was to bring together all the nations of Europe to secure peace in Europe, to build up Europe's economy,
uh-huh.
because Europe lacked economies of scale like you saw in the United States and
Hmm.
China,
Hmm.
even to some extent in Russia.
Yeah.
And I thought that this would work out. This is the right way for Europe to go. And I have to say this, it has turned out to be a disaster. This is where I failed completely as an analyst. I mean, there were people who were warning
Hmm.
that it's not going to turn out this way,
Yes.
that uh, bringing Europe together in that way would mean that you'd have a Europe that was far less than the sum of its parts, as we say. You know, that it would be not, you would not get a stronger Europe, you would get a weaker Europe. And
Hmm.
that is exactly how it has turned out. It means that politics has drained away from the European countries, because politics inside the European countries no longer has any meaning anymore, because you elect people, but they're not accountable to you properly. They are responsible to the secretariat, if you like, the commission in Brussels. I mean, that's where the decisions, the big decisions are made now. You have never created institutions at the center that could develop any kind of general economic policy. And ultimately, the foreign policy that you have created is the narrowest and the most objectionable that you could possibly have. So instead of a greater Europe, by which a greater Europe, I mean a better Europe, we have a smaller, weaker, uglier, more marginal Europe, a Europe which now seems to be in a state of appalling decay.
Hmm.
So this, as I said, it's very sad for me, but you saw it on display at that meeting in the White House. I mean, they all go to cower before Donald Trump. I mean, it's not as if this
Yeah.
is Franklin Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy or some,
Hmm.
great leader of the
Hmm.
United States. This is a man that many people in America don't take seriously. And yet the Europeans are there, groveling in front of him. I mean, what more disgraceful and
Hmm.
shameful performance could you see than that?
Yeah.
And nothing illustrates better, as I said, the decline of Europe than this.
Yeah. The seven dwarfs. That's what
Yeah,
what
the
it says.
seven dwarfs, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well.
the mighty powers, the
Hmm.
countries that carved up China. Hmm?
Yeah. Yeah.
That the Germans were in
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Tianjin, and the
Yeah.
British and the China and the French had
Uh-huh.
Shanghai. That
Yeah.
carved up of Shanghai, and the
Mhm.
British had Hong Kong, and all of that. And now they're reduced to this level. Well, you could say there's a justice in
Yeah, yeah, could be, yeah.
it.
Well, I guess it's just that Europe lack a real leader, I guess.
Mm,
When you put everything together, becomes such a big entity with so many
mm,
countries. You need
mm,
some powerful leader to
mm.
can really lead the place, but they don't
Yeah.
have one, I
No,
guess. So,
no. Or and the political setup in Europe
hmm.
works against any
Okay.
such person
Uh-huh.
ever appearing,
Yeah. Yeah.
because anybody like that would have to first become a strong leader in one of the national
Hmm.
states. And that means that the EU centre, as I refer to it, would immediately see that person as a threat to
Yeah.
itself, and
Hmm.
would do everything it could to undermine him.
Yeah. For example, Orban, for example, I would,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So the whole purpose, like you said in the beginning, was to make peace with Russia against China. So let's talk about
Yes.
the trade war with China.
Yes.
Now, Trump just add another 407 products that related to steel aluminum tariffs 100%. What is stunning to me is now we know that he already put on 50% for all the steel and the aluminum, which you mentioned that Britain was shocked by that.
Yes.
But now he's adding products that is related to steel and aluminum,
Yes.
and among others like tractors, bulldozers, compressors, and pumps. Now these are the things I immediately thought that the farmers need, the smaller
Yes.
farmland they need. So I find this is something fascinating to me that the Biden administration, they put in a lot of unreasonable regulations to the farmers that they needed this permits and that permits and expensive equipment to improve their,
Yeah.
filter the water, to be environmental friendly, to be, food safety, that kind of thing. And that got lots of farmers very angry.
Yes.
And now he's not targeting just the farmers, the small farmers, but this is punishing the farmer. I mean, put on
Yeah.
unreasonable burden on them.
Yes.
So it seems like the United States government seems that Republican, Democrat, they don't seem to care about the farmers. I don't understand that.
No, they don't. They don't. Either there are not enough of them anymore to make a difference in elections. And once upon a time, within my living memory, people who worked in the land in the United States were a significant political lobby because, they had votes. They could change the votes in key states, and those states were important in the electoral college and all of that. I mean, that isn't true anymore. And the other thing that's happening is that farming in the United States has become very much the work of old men.
Yeah.
which is apparently most farmers are well into their 60s, so you don't worry about them anymore. Now, one of the things about America, about its history, is that it's the source of its economic growth, its economic upsurge in the 19th century was farming. It was a major food exporter. What the Europeans did was they bought American grain and food products from the United States. And so it was American food production and agricultural production, cotton and other things like that, which were what originally got the American economy going and making it, the big economic colossus. And then for most of my life, the American agricultural system was always held up as this enormously efficient system that, produced all these enormous food surpluses. And what this is going to do, these latest tariffs are going to do, is it's going to create an enormous crisis. It's going to cut into its costs. I mean, it's going to increase those costs even more. America is already losing its position as a major food exporter. And here one could say this is where the Russians are going to start stepping in, because, of course, they, on the contrary, are working very, very hard to build up their agricultural industries.
Yeah, one thing is the soybeans. And just to give you the number, in 2024, China purchased approximately 12.8 billion worth of US soybeans. And this year, this is the season. Right now, it's the season.
Yeah.
0. So China bought 0 soybeans from the United States.
Well, there you go.
That tells you the crisis.
The crisis. They're presumably buying them now from Brazil. I'm
Brazil,
guessing.
Argentina, yes. And these kind of thing, once you shift, it's hard to shift back because you always have long-term
correct
contracts, right?
Correct.
And to the degree that American Soybean Association now sent a letter to Trump, basically telling Trump to get this trade dispute with China to resolve ASAP because they are paying the price.
Yes.
I don't know whether that will be working.
No.
But okay, let's say he doesn't care about the farmers. How about like a John Deere, kind of a manufacturer? John Deere, John Deere is suffering from both sides. The tariffs, even though it is American company, and they are making those machines here in the United States, but they export, but they also import lots of the parts.
Yes.
And so the parts now are getting more expensive, making them less competitive internationally for them to export.
Yes.
And the farmers, the farming industry is weakening. So their client are losing. They're losing money from their client. So doesn't Trump consider these kind of effects?
No, I don't think he does. I mean, I get the sense, and I've been listening to all of these bizarre people that he's gathered around him, people like Peter Navarro and Stephen Moran, I don't get the sense these people have any understanding of supply chains and of the complexities involved in supply chains, and the fact that you can't do X until you've done Y. I mean, they just don't get this at all. They think that if you simply stop, then that will simply mean that Caterpillar produces more tractors again. And they don't understand that Caterpillar and John Deere and all of these places, that those tractors they make use they use steel from wherever, they use machine tools. They need machine tools from China. They need components from all sorts of places. They just don't get it, and they probably think that to the extent that these things are needed somehow, but through some kind of spontaneous process, the American economy is going to produce them itself. It's not. Industry doesn't work that way. I mean, these people don't have a knowledge of industry. As I think I've said many times, I do. I have worked in the past. It's a while back, but I did when Britain had an industry. I used to go to factories and see how production worked and understand a bit about supply chains. And I could already see the problems then, by the way. But I mean, I don't think these people have any understanding of any of this at all.
Do you think that's part of the reason Trump is pressuring India so hard to open its agriculture sectors?
Yes.
Trump is trying to replace the Chinese market with India agriculture market.
Well, yes,
is that the reason? That's part of the reason?
That's absolutely part of the reason. And it's one of the reasons the Americans are so angry with India. By the way, I mean, the things the Americans are now saying about India are just shocking. I mean, Peter Navarro wrote a thing in the Financial Times, which I couldn't believe it when I read it. I mean, they're furious with India. And of course, they talk about Russian oil, but I mean, deep down, it's other things like agricultural products and things of that kind. And of course, the Indians are trying to explain to the Americans, we cannot do these things you are asking us. Not only would that mean that we are forfeiting our independence, if we were to do these things, we would undermine the pillars of our own economy and of our society, and we would create an enormous domestic crisis. And Prime Minister Modi, is going around India, reassuring people in India that for him, the rights, the interests of agricultural producers remains paramount.
Plus, I'm not sure you can easily replace China. I mean, soybean, for example, I'm not sure India will eat that much soybean.
But they don't. It plays no part at all in Indian cuisine, which, of course, as a British person, I'm very familiar with indeed. I mean, soybeans are very much. I mean, they were originally very, very much part of East Asian food, and I don't know whether your Chinese viewers are aware of the fact that the first reference to tofu in the English language was made in a letter by Benjamin Franklin.
Really?
Who was, yes, absolutely, who is a vegetarian. And he said that the Chinese have developed this extraordinary food called tofu, which can substitute for meat.
Okay.
There we go.
It reminds me that it's stunning how little knowledge or even interest of different countries' uniqueness, right? Remember, Australia for a while had a big spat with China, at the behest of the United States. And so China stopped buying Australia lobster. And they immediately said, oh, we can turn into India. Do they know that India lots of them are vegetarian?
Yes, I know. No, they don't.
They don't check.
No, absolutely.
But you see, I was a consultant for IBM. When I was working as a consultant, we do all kinds of, market research. We dice it, and, every aspect, every subgroup, so we want to understand them, etc. how come when it's about foreign policy, there is no consulting involvement to understand these countries, these markets at all, it seems like.
Well, there
It's
isn't, because
basic.
I mean, we come back to the way in which the American political system works, and the class of people who become politicians and who enter the State Department, and as we know, they come from Ivy League universities where
Yeah.
they do certain types of degrees, and they come from certain types of schools. That they don't have that background, which, by the way, the US government in the past absolutely did. I mean, once upon a time, if you were to become US Commerce Secretary, I mean, you would have been somebody who'd worked in industry and would have a knowledge of these things. It's the same in Britain. I can remember when I was much younger than I am today, in the 1970s, for example, British ministers who were dealing with commerce and industry had backgrounds in commerce and industry. I mean, if they were conservatives, they would be the owners or managers of industrial companies. If they were labor people, they would have worked in the labor unions, and they would have been involved in the production process that way. But there's nothing like that in politics anymore.
Okay, the chips war. Now, the
Yes.
articles that you sent to me, I find interesting is that
Yeah.
they claim that now the latest one is Nvidia now is halts its production for H20 because
Yes.
it's not going to be sold in China. I mean, China never banned it. Okay, China just advised all the corporations that there is a backdoor.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
The article you sent it to me, Financial Times, that they claim that China was very angry because of Harvard Lutnick comments that we are giving China the poor quality, the not the best ones, and that upset.
I knew you'd pick up on that nonsense. just carry on anyway.
Well, that's not how China make
No,
decisions.
no, I know.
But
Exactly.
but here's what I
Exactly.
think happening is that China investigated H20 because it has the back door, but the United States and maybe the West in general don't want people to pay attention to that part. So they throw out this, oh, Lutnick had these comments and China got very upset. So now they stop buying
Yeah,
H20 because that.
exactly. I mean,
Is
that
that
is the quality of reporting that you get in the media today. The fascinating thing about that Financial Times article is that squirreled in towards the end was the admission that China has already developed another chip, which is actually better. That has nothing to do with it. It's because Lutnick said something which somebody in the Chinese Politburo wasn't happy with. I mean, that's the implication of the article. The fact that the Chinese already have a more advanced chip than the HS20. That has nothing to do with the decision making that China makes. It gives you a sense of the and by the way, I suspect not only will most of the people who read that article believe it and believe that silly story, but the people who wrote it probably believe it too. That's what's so extraordinary about this. It gives you a sense of the utterly facile, the childish way in which these things are discussed in the West now. It's not really the fact that China has evolved beyond this technology. So why should they accept an inferior technology when they already have a better one? It is because somebody in the United States said something which made somebody in China angry. That's the way everything is supposedly done nowadays.
Tell you, if they ever pay attention to what Lutnick said, they wouldn't be upset about this. The only thing they would think is that, oh, this is not a very advanced chip. So okay, what should we do about it? That they would see it as such, rather than, oh, this so I'm so angry, I have to cancel it. That's not how they. That's not how they work.
No. Well, China has. This is the thing again. So many people have an inability to understand this. China has a massive industrial, science, and technology base, an enormous one, the biggest in the world, much bigger than that of the United States. I mean, it is Today, it is bigger than that of the United States. 20 years ago, the US had the biggest science and technology base in the world and had done so since the Second World War and beyond. That is not true anymore. China has a much bigger one. China has a manufacturing base which is far greater than that of the United States. China has all of the parts that it needs to make the most advanced chips. They'll be able to make the most advanced lithography machines, far more advanced than those that the Dutch are making. I've learned something about that technology. I know some of the work that is being done in terms of, the advanced lithography. In 5 years' time, we'll be buying Chinese chips. We won't even be getting them from Taiwan anymore. And people who tell me, well, it will take the China 5-10 years to catch up. No, it won't. Yes, chip production is very complicated and very difficult. But to say that China, of all countries, can't get on top of it is stupid.
Yeah, and I think this whole, chips ban to China, it actually, in the long run, serves China probably better in a way.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes.
Because not only China needs to, make their own chips eventually, replace all the chips from the West, but also China, in the meantime, like a Deepstate, are working around so that they can make the existing chips more efficient.
Yes.
And so the next model that they just recently launched is to target using Huawei chips, which is not the most high-end chips that NVIDIA has, but it's nonetheless, getting there.
Yeah.
And so what they're doing now is also creating, okay, I'm designing the AI model based on using your chips. That created an ecosystem, which is so much powerful, So
absolutely.
I don't know.
I mean, the other thing is that there's too much discussion about chips anyway. I mean, chips are very, very important. I don't want to dispute this, but they're only part of the overall technological thing. I mean, I was having a long discussion with somebody who's absolutely a Swiss person, by the way, who is absolutely there at the forefront with AI. And he said the most important thing, if you really want to break through into AI, is electricity generation.
Yeah.
I mean, you can always sort out the problem with the chips, but if you don't have the electric power, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
The United States is not doing anything about that. China is.
Yeah.
But it's not even that. I mean, you need the programmers, you need the thinkers. You need all of these things. And by the way, there's a good article, believe it or not, in The Economist today, which also says straightforwardly that you cannot make the kind of advanced chips in the United States that are being currently made in Taiwan. There are fundamental industrial and supply issues which make that impractical. The US, even if it manages to get Taiwan to transfer some of its production to the United States, is still going to have to rely on Taiwan for its most advanced chips. Now, that, by the way, brings me to another point, which is another reason why China needs to establish leadership in this field, is precisely because chips is the one thing that Taiwan has. And you've got to kick that prop from underneath the secessionist groups that run Taiwan. And at that point, then, of course, as I said, the remaining matters become simpler because people in Taiwan understand that they don't really have anything over China at all. Exactly.
One more thing is regarding China-U.S. relations is that the U.S. Philippines recently they agreed to conduct more than 500 military activities for 2026. Now, I assume that is Albert Colby probably behind this. He's working at the Pentagon, right? So, but 500 Military activities, that's more than one per day. What are they doing? Are they really gearing up a war against China now? You
Well, indeed,
think?
absolutely. That's exactly what they're doing. If China had an agreement with Mexico to conduct 500 military activities in the Gulf of Mexico and on the Pacific coast, the Americans would definitely say that it's
Mhm.
preparations for war against the US. So why shouldn't China think exactly that
Mhm.
about all of these preparations that the US is conducting with the Philippines? Of course, the Americans say that they're protecting the Philippines. Firstly, there is no sign that China has any aggressive plans against the Philippines. Why would China want to have
Yeah.
aggressive plans against the Philippines? And to the extent that there are tensions between the Philippines and China, it's because these exercises are
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
In other words, it's because the Americans are there.
And overall, because we know that Trump did this whole Alaska thing is to get
Mm,
the Russians on their side to go
yeah.
against China.
Yes. Yes.
How much do you think that from Russia's side will trust the United States?
They don't, and I think this is another thing to say. Actually, it's an important one. There remains, first of all, I mean, I think it's this is something that must be acknowledged. There used to be, and to a very limited extent, there continues to be a certain section of Russian society, perhaps mostly in the intelligentsia
Mhm.
and in parts of what you might call the oligarchic
Mhm.
part of the
Mhm.
business community that was intensely pro-American. And you used to come across these people quite often when you went to Russia, at least, and met with the kind of people that I did when I was there. That has gone into deep eclipse. And most of those people have either left Russia or changed their views. But I'm not saying that you won't ever find some people still like that there. There also exists, or used to exist, and I think still exists, a community of people within the former Soviet elite, people who were genuine Soviet patriots and people of this kind,
Mhm.
who always hankered for some kind of relationship with the United States, not because they wanted to, Americanize their society or because they wanted to become vassals of the United States,
Mhm.
but because the United States was their great adversary. They saw the United States as the rival. They also wanted to make the Soviet Union, Russia, as powerful, as rich as the United States was. The United States, in some respects, was their model. I
Mhm.
think some of that influence in a few corners still is there.
Mhm.
You can see this when you listen to people like Kirill Dmitriev, for example, who is the head of Russia's direct investment fund, and who, by the way, is Harvard educated.
Okay.
So,
Mhm.
so I mean, there is still this. I mean, he was sent by the Soviets to
Mhm.
America to learn all of these things. Um, but my own sense is that with every passing day, that element is shrinking, and that in a complete reversal from what you used to see at the end of the Cold War, where it was the older Soviet officials who were suspicious of the US and the younger ones who wanted a rapprochement with the
Mhm.
United States, so that when the younger ones, led by Gorbachev, took over, we all remember what happened.
Mhm.
Today, it's the exact reverse. It's the older ones, the people left over from, if you like, the Gorbachev era, who's, I mean, they may not be Gorbachevists, but
Mhm.
who still want to have some kind of connection with the
Mhm.
US, who are still there, still have a bit of influence. Lavrov sometimes himself sometimes talks in that kind of way.
Mhm.
But you have the other, much more hard-nosed
Mhm.
people who coming up, uh, who are saying the Americans are just terrible.
Mhm.
We've seen what they're really like. Some of us have been to America and we're not that impressed. Let's focus instead on doing what we do well. Forget about these awful people. And China is. a country closer at home. We're learning Chinese now. It's Chinese goods, Chinese cars that we're starting to drive. And let's forget about this. So I think there's a cultural shift in Russia going on, and it's not one to be underestimated. I think that, and it's one that is intensifying. When I went to Russia a few months ago, two months ago, I was at a conference of lawyers, civilian people, exactly the kind of people who once upon a time would have looked to the West. And they don't do that anymore, especially not the younger ones. I think I mentioned this in previous programs. So no, I don't think this is ever going to happen. I think that that possibility has long since gone.
But yeah, but they will keep trying to
Oh,
hold.
of course.
Yeah.
Well, because they still believe this. They still imagine that, if we could somehow break through, if we can get rid of this terrible man, Mr. Putin, the Russians will, ultimately deep down, they still love us. They still want to be like us, and we'll be able to win them over again. I read articles after articles like that in the think tank media in the United States, and this is completely wrong. As I said, they are talking about a Russia that existed 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. It's not like that anymore.
And they're also talking about the United States existed 30 years ago. I think
Absolutely,
today's,
yeah.
And the Gaza situation. So the latest one, the Gaza city will be raised if Hamas does not agree our terms. This is what Israeli ministers are saying. So you see, Trump is so eager to get the Nobel Peace Prize, but he's not going to do anything at all, right, to protect Gaza from any of these aggressions. Okay.
Well, he supports it. I mean, if you're the president of the United States, and your main ally in the Middle East is Israel, and Israel is doing something like this, and you don't oppose it, then you're supporting it. I mean, this is it's to my mind, it is as straightforward as that.
Yeah. And then the Western leaders, they all claim we're going to recognize the Palestinian, state in the next UN. Why can't they just recognize now? Why do they have to wait until the next UN meeting?
Well, you're completely correct about it. It's so that the Israelis can come up with some nice form of words that they can all hide behind, so that they don't have to do what they really don't want to do. I mean, this isn't real. It's not diplomacy. It's not done in good faith. It's all the opposite of that.
Yeah. And that's what the Lavrov is saying. He said the West is delaying recognition of a Palestine until there is no Palestine left to recognize. That's what they're.
Yes.
Not only that, the U.S. DoD asked the Congress for more than $3.5 billion in emergency funds to refill weapons stockpiles deployed by Operation Link to Israel. Yes. Sounds like Israel is still preparing to attack Iran. Is that so? Okay.
Yes, it is. Israel is indeed intending to attack Iran. Iran knows that Israel is preparing to attack Iran. And the Iranians are starting to, well, not they're starting, they are taking measures to prepare for this. And it's not been widely reported, but Pezeshkian, the Iranian president, has clearly said this, that the Israelis are going, that there's going to be another Israeli attack very soon, and a more powerful one this time. And Iran has created a special headquarters to deal with this attack when it comes. Again, it's been reported in the Iranian media, but as far as I know, nowhere else. And Khamenei's, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, he sent Ali Larijani, his national security advisor, to Moscow, where he had a meeting with Putin. And the Iranian defense minister also went to Moscow during the same trip and also met with Putin. And they're all coming to Shanghai, or they're all coming to China, but not Shanghai, to China for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization
Yeah.
meet. They're preparing.
Okay.
I mean, we will very likely in the autumn have another war in the Middle East.
And it seems like Trump is going to invade Venezuela because he deployed 3 missile destroyers to the waters of Venezuela.
Yes.
Now he claimed to counter the drug cartels, but nobody believes that, right? Why does he want to start a war with Venezuela? I don't understand this.
You send missile destroyers to just to stop drug smugglers. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And you're quite right. It looks as if he's preparing some kind of war against Venezuela as well. Another crisis. The whole thing has about this the look, and I have to say this, of a country that's becoming increasingly a bully. Because it needs to prove to itself that it's still strong.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because actually, Trump actually said one time, he said he had a conversation with Orban. Orban said, on trade and economy, you can't beat China. On the battlefield, NATO cannot defeat Russia. And he said, it's interesting that he says that. So it sounds like he almost agrees with Orban.
Yes.
He didn't say that, but it must be for him to hear that, it cannot be very pleasant. So he needs to do something to prove.
This is exactly. I mean, both the Biden era and the Trump era are different American responses to the sense that they're losing their leading position in the world. So Biden, I mean, the whole the coalition of democracies against the axis of autocracies and all of that, and the attempts to isolate China and all of that, and of course provoking Russia into a war which is intended to weaken Russia and all those things. Trump taking a slightly different approach, trying to doing what he thinks, wrongly by the way, that Nixon set out to do when Nixon went to Beijing to win China and play the China card against the Soviet Union. He wants to play the Russia card against China, and he wants to, establish American mastery in the Middle East and in Venezuela of all places, and gain control of the oil and all that. As I said, these are just the games that are played by somebody who senses that the game ultimately is lost. They look increasingly reckless and increasingly dangerous. I remember reading about 2 years ago a really, really interesting piece, editorial in Global Times, which said that China and its various partners, Russia especially, but the others too, in aggregate are far more powerful than the old Warsaw Pact ever was, which is completely true, by the way. All they need to do is keep calm. And in the end, it will all come right. And they're absolutely right. The Americans, by the way, by contrast, are showing increasing signs of, well, I think the word panic is not entirely wrong. They're not panicking every day. They're not running around tearing out their hair. But there's a kind of quiet panic which is gradually growing, and that's why they're making all these very strange decisions. They're also going to invade Mexico too, by the way. my Catherine, my wife, was just a few days ago was in Mexico, and they're talking all about it there.
Well, there's an article I think last night I read it, that Trump said he's withdrawing temporarily from this peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. And one thing apparently he's privately told his advisors that he said this is way more complex than I thought. So at least he realized that. So he realized this is too much for him to handle. Okay. So he's temporarily withdraw, So the
temporarily withdrawing, he's going to come back as the Messiah. when it's all over and sorted all out. I mean, in some ways, one almost feels sorry for him actually when he talks in that way.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see what happens. Let's see this meeting if taken place. Okay, it's highly questionable there, I think.
Well,
right?
I mean, the Russians never agreed to it. I mean, I think that's just the other thing to say. I mean, they never ever agreed to a meeting with Zelensky at this time. Trump told everybody that they had, but as I said, I mean, he hears what he wants to hear, and he doesn't listen properly to what others are saying, and that's why this meeting in Anchorage has turned out to be a mess.
Trump likes to do that. Before anything becomes a reality, he will declare, it's done deal.
Yes, exactly.
TikTok, how many times we heard, TikTok's going to do this and that. And oh, by the way, the White House actually set up a TikTok account now. It's illegal because TikTok is banned in the United States. So federal government and the state government, they're not supposed to have an account on TikTok. Now the White House set up an account on TikTok. So anyway.
I mean, you can't make this up. Anyway, there it is.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So let's see next week what happens.
Indeed,
maybe in the meantime, there will be a war in Mexico, Venezuela. We will see.
We will see. We will see. And in the meantime, China goes on its way, calm, at peace with itself and the world. Just goes on growing. Anyway, there it is.
Thank you very much.
Great pleasure to speak to you today, and look forward to our program next week.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you again. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.
Bye.